Very quickly, the question ultimately was the connection between centers and teaching programs, and specifically departments. And I think that's an important issue. The history of many of these centers is that they are sort of isolated units operating sort of unto themselves. But the trick really is to make that connection between existing departments and the center in such a way that those departments see both the value and necessity of lending not only support, but to actually to invest in those centers in a way that otherwise they would ignore. And this is a practical question, it's a political question. And on the practical side, we at PCUH have appointed, we have different categories of individuals, faculty members within the college who are in effect tenured, are members of the center, but we have affiliates. And the affiliates are drawn from across the university, various departments. We have people in environmental sciences, a person who's working on, of all things, a Ukrainian community garden with students in order to examine sort of the cultural practice of what it means to grow a medicinal garden on the prairies. We have a sociologist. We have who's working with Germans in the Mennonite community, but is an affiliate at the center. So all these individuals, in many ways, have a practical need to be associated with the center, and in so doing, they necessarily also bring their experience to their respective departments and underscore its value. The other point is really it's a political question. And as long as these centers ultimately are doing the kind of important work that they do, and we by the way, we do a lot, and we do a lot with very little resources. And it's extraordinary the amount of attention that we get as a result. And so there's a kind of compelling reason on the part of departments to factor in the center in their decision-making process about faculty hires. That's not always the case, but we can make but we at the center make that sort of compelling case for a faculty hire in a particular department when that becomes available, if you will. So that's kind of answer to your question and concern. But I think my interest in all of this has a lot to do with, we innovate, we accept the fact that Ukraine has now become a part of the normal sort of a normal state, a normal society, if I can say that as such. But having said that, worthy of scholarship, analysis, assessment, and so on and so forth. So we do these things and we hope for the best outcome, but there's a context to consider, and that context is the context of austerity and the kinds of things that have been happening in the last 20 years or so. I was hired on, not as a Ukrainianist, but somebody who was to teach in conflict, human rights, international organizations. I have an interest in Ukrainian studies as a kind of sidebar. But the fact is, when I arrived there and I saw the state of affairs, this could not last. And so we took the initiative to change the dynamic in such a way that should Ukrainian studies disappear, in fact, in its traditional setting, it did disappear. But we were there to catch the fall. We were there to ensure that it would survive another day. But we also had to recommend something different than what was already there. And that's where the multidisciplinarity, the interdisciplinarity comes in, and everything that everybody's talking about. And we've done that. But at the end of the day, it also requires for us, and here's the point, here's the essence, here's the nub. It's not about teaching, it's about learning. And so the emphasis is on students. I will put my money on students every day of the week, because they are the future. And they are what what we need to do. And it's not about producing the next crop of scholars. Sure, there'll be the one in the, I've had 17 graduate students, 3 have appointments at universities, at the University of London, University of Regina, Rochester University, and the rest of it. And they carry with them the experience of having studied under me with a Ukrainian focus. Fair enough. They integrate some of that in terms of their teaching experience. But it's not them. It's the students who, in effect, have come to the university and will dabble in Ukrainian studies, take the odd Ukrainian class, but it's the experience. It's the experience of being within Ukrainian life at a university that matters most. I, for one, You know, I took the odd Ukrainian language course at the university, but my training was in political studies. But the experience of working with other students in the Ukrainian Students Club, with Bohdan Kordan, Olga Kuplovska, Roman Senkus, Myroslav Shkandrij, everybody, the Homyak sisters, has become formative in my life. It's had become formative in my life, and I've taken this and it's informed me, and that's why I do what I do. And this is what I want for this crop of students, this generation of students, and for the next one. And so my purpose isn't about graduate students, although yes, we need to do that. It's really about giving them the experience that they take with them in their lives and know that this is important to them and, of course, the community in which they belong. Thank you.
The question that Heather posed with respect to lack of confidence of our language students, and this is not a criteria, but that's rather our results, which is a bit alarming. And perhaps if we ask ourselves, I teach right now the first level beginner's Ukrainian course, do I address this question enough? So this is an example of the result of the study, which perhaps needs to be paid attention to, that lack of confidence in our language learners could be a demotivator. From our study, we note that this lack of confidence stems from one factor is the different proficiencies levels and different background knowledge, as well as other factors that we discuss. With respect to overall comments, I do want to stress our need for understanding our today's learner. We need to adapt and renovate, as Bohdan Kordan mentioned. And Taras mentioned that perhaps Ukrainian studies could be, how did you say, a main dish or a dessert? I would say perhaps it should be an ingredient. But I would like to just stress the fact that our today's reality is changing. Our students are different. We need to learn about our students. We need to adapt to their learning needs. And again, with respect to interdisciplinarities, Ukrainian language learning most likely needs to be combined with other disciplines. We do offer a business Ukrainian course at the University of Alberta, which attracts a good number of students, and I believe that we should move into a direction of introducing courses of language and history, language and political science, economic, and so on. Yes, we do have administrative, what is the word I'm looking for? Challenges, but I think we need to face those challenges, and we will do so.
Okay, I have a very brief response. It is a pleasure to work with colleagues, historians, and learn from them, which we do. Usually it's in academic venues, conference venues. It's great to have CAUS for this platform and cooperate with. It's great that U of T, in addition to Slavic department, has chair of Ukrainian studies and have a supporter, both through publication and personally through our chair. What I was trying to emphasize is that it would be today especially, but not only today, it's very difficult to shame the students. You're Ukrainian, you have to do this stuff because you have to do it. It's difficult to make this, this is your obligation, your cross to carry. I think there are ways of showing that Ukrainian subject or Ukrainian material can be a source of intellectual, aesthetic, psychological, emotional joy, if you wish. That is, there is enough there that is valuable and just joyous in itself to experience those best examples of thought, of inspiration, and we should be able to communicate that. And that's probably the most effective way of attracting students. Otherwise, it will be difficult. And again, these venues, whether they come from Russian and suddenly, oh my gosh, this is something different. Doesn't matter. Some students come from Russian, some come from, sometimes I can't pronounce their names, but I'm sure they get some useful couple of ideas out of Ukrainian texts and culture.
On normalization, Bohdan said, Ukraine's become normal. And I know what he meant, but I'm sure people on Maidan would not have agreed. They were on Maidan precisely because they were tired of not living in a normal country, but that's not what you meant, obviously. And what we mean here is that by normal is that Ukraine has become very interesting, actually, to study. As a case, I mean, look at it. The Orange Revolution was wild enough, but Maidan is just, I mean, in terms of how can it, not in terms of the consequences, obviously, there's nothing exciting about that, but how could any country in the world go through 2 instances of mass mobilization in 10 years? And massive, I mean, we know the details, we've all followed that. It's just amazing. So it draws people in, and that's the most spectacular example. And obviously we have now a whole community of scholars who are interested in wars, civil wars, and so forth. I mean, they're looking at the Ukraine case because it's the largest case since, well, second largest case since in Europe since World War II with the Balkans War, right? And it's happening in Europe. So that's the kind of normalization that we see very much in social science, as I try to explain, very broadly defined, and even it's surprising me how broadly it can be defined. But I know since we keep mingling with historians, that the situation with archives, no matter how problematic issues always are in Ukraine, they're infinitely better than in Russia. And I think your own personal experience is not just an anecdote. It reflects a trend. If you want to study World War II or memory politics in Russia, well, good luck. Everything is, completely closed, and anyway, you'll be followed by the FSB if you do that. And whereas in Ukraine, with all the controversy, there's actually a lot of archives that are open, which means that in practice, then the literature and the research that's being done is qualitatively, if not quantitatively, at a very high level for anyone interested in these broad historical matters. So from my vantage point, I see indeed Ukrainian studies experiencing a period of remarkable growth across the board. But obviously, we're talking about the study of Ukraine, not the study of the diaspora in Canada. It's kind of 2 different worlds that intersect at some level, but not always. It's two different experiences. And that means, again, as I try to emphasize in my talk, students, now whether they're of Ukrainian background or not, are being drawn into Ukraine, because it is, I think Professor Khanenko said cool this morning. She realized that she's a cool scholar herself, K-U-L-E. I have cool students in both sense of the terms. But that's just the reality. Now, my reality, unlike, let's say, the institutions here at the University of Alberta or Toronto, where there are more resources despite all the constraints and the possibility of actually having courses in Ukrainian language, which unfortunately we still don't have at the University of Ottawa, but there are ways, to remedy that. There's all these booming summer schools in Ukraine. That's how I learned Ukrainian. I just went to Ukraine, and there you go. Ostash put me on a radio station program. The day I arrived in Ukraine, I never really spoken Ukrainian in my life, but there you were. I could read it, so I had enough few words to say, and I was very happy to be here. So that the last point I would make, since it was raised, and it is indeed a serious issue, and I can see that for the younger generation, people very close to me, that is the issue of jobs. I mean, it's great to have all this young cohort, but is there an overproduction, like Bob Magocsi said? It is a real problem. But I looked at my little database yesterday, and I realized, actually, of the 50 doctoral students that we've had over the years, I could count 14 who found jobs. Now, of these 50, many are still doctoral students, and some are postdocs, or they're still around. I mean, who got a job immediately first year in the market, right? And of these 14, actually 5 were in anthropology. So you've got Ukrainian studies now growing in places
Anthro is really big.
Yeah, it is big.
Yeah.
there's terrific things that can be done. It's big also in Russian studies. That's the one thing that probably can still be done in Russia without the FSB running after you. But we see that in Europe as well, and not just when I'm talking about the job market. I mean, it's also very difficult in Western Europe in particular, but somehow there are a critical mass of young people either who get regular jobs, or in Europe they have all these, they have a very different system that you can get like a permanent research position, like in Germany or in France, that we don't have here, except perhaps in some institutes. And there's quite a few who manage to find themselves a niche. Enough for, again, for me to just witness basically a quantitative growth in the Ukrainian studies that I experienced. Thank you.
I'll just take a couple of minutes. I'm from the University of Manitoba, as most of you probably know. I'll just take a couple of minutes to tell you just one or two things about that, our program. You know, I've taught languages and literatures for almost 40 years in 4 different universities. I've always been pretty much the only person in that program. Sometimes I've been the only person that taught the language as well as the literature. And the small programs have a special difficulty. It's always been like that, as I said in my introductory comments. But now the climate at universities has changed, and this poses a very different set of problems. Our university this year cut all languages that were not on a departmental banner. So Arabic, Hebrew, Yiddish, Icelandic, anything that was not linked to a banner program disappeared. So we're in a different climate. You have to be aware of that. Many of the problems we can learn from the Germans, from the Russians, from the Poles. I'm in a department where all those languages are taught. And when I was head, they wanted to cut German. They wanted to cut Slavic. We survived, and German now is booming. But there's special things, there are things that can be done to improve language teaching. There's the things that can be done to improve the programs, the way they're delivered, the way they're taught, the way they're conceived. And part of that has to do with high schools. German survives and is booming because they have all the way up to university entrance, they have German in high schools. And there's a very easy move for students. You can contact them in the last year of high school. They jump immediately into university teaching. The other thing that, one of the themes that repeatedly comes through that I agree with completely is you can't just teach language alone. There has to be a reason for a student to learn the language. Sometimes they come from the content, the issues to the language, sometimes the other way. But that means there has to be a link between language teaching and other forms of other instructions, so the students see the need for it. And on the good side of things, literature is no longer literature. Literature is now anything you want it to be. It can be political studies, it can be history, it can be cultural memory, psychology, whatever you want it to be. It can be anything, really, and it's all over the map. So we can now shape courses in interesting, exciting ways, the way Taras and all the panelists have suggested. So it's not all terribly dark. Are there any graduate students that want to make a statement or a comment? Yes?
She's a Québécoise.
Yes, she is.
Genia Boivin. Jennifer?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
I don't think this works. Oh, yeah, it does. Thanks, Claire. I do have a question concerning the programs. As Dr. Shkandrij said that we're all very, very small programs, and my question is addressing the competition between our programs. Right now, all of you are from different universities, so this is not really a problem, but sometimes within the same university, you have Ukrainian studies in language and in literature and in folklore, and all these programs are competing with each other. And the reason why I'm asking this question is one of you guys, I can't remember which one, has said that Ukrainian language is not Ukrainian studies per se, but a tool to do Ukrainian studies. And it seems to me that this is already a bit of a problem. So how do you plan, I guess, to address these competing programs within the same university that are all dealing with Ukrainian studies?
Don't remember who said that, but we don't have competing programs. They've all disappeared.
Can I said tool, but I didn't mean it, I didn't mean that language is simply a tool, of course. And as I said it, that was not what I meant. But what I guess what I actually meant was that it may not be apparent to students at the beginning, but that in fact language is the glue, and language is what we share across that we share in common, and that we need in common to pursue our field in a sophisticated way in order for our students to do advanced work in our field. And so actually it was that I see it as sort of as the glue and as the net in the network. As well as being a subject of study in and of itself. And one of the things that I think that we can be very proud of here at the U of A is the really an innovative work that our Ukrainianists have done in language study. Alla has published a textbook, and I know there's been a lot of innovative work in language teaching, and that is critical. Thanks.
Any other graduate students? Yes.
I would like to address my comment to the topic that was discussed yesterday also and today about Ukrainian studies and about students that involved in the program, they registered for the program. So about the representation of the possibilities of Ukrainian studies outside of Canada or outside of the Western world back in Ukraine. Because 3 years ago I came as a master's student, and I knew through private sources about this program. And when I was at the university and I heard that it's not so many students there from Ukraine, I was wondering, like, how did they manage to bring those students who are here to Canada? Because it's a big rise of interest to study abroad back in Ukraine, and a lot of educational fairs, educational exhibit, but Ukrainian studies and humanities doesn't represent at all. No humanities on these fairs. So there is MBA program, there is IT, and maybe English language for those who would like to stay in Canada or who would like to stay somewhere else. So I think that is a task of the university, probably university administration, but Ukrainian institution or Ukrainian program, they can address maybe say a little bit more often to the university administration that the opportunities, especially if it addressed to the Ukrainian studies, it could be better represented back in that countries where it could be more interest to the programs.
Well, I think partially that's been addressed. Many students from Ukraine get recruited and brought to Canadian universities, and there are grants. We find grants for them. This is one way in which these programs have survived. We don't all have as many grants. University of Manitoba doesn't get, cannot access some of the money that is made available through KIUS because it's earmarked in specific ways, but we find money in different ways, so we've brought students. And there is an interest, of course, and it does help. It's actually it's a very good way of blending students from Ukraine with local students. It really improves the educational experience. Is that what you were talking about? From Ukraine here, or going from here to Ukraine? No?
I think it's about promoting the
Promoting
programs available here in Ukraine so that they know.
Promoting the programs in Ukraine.
Yes.
I didn't meant money in my comment.
Right.
And I know that those graduate students who are registered and who are accepted, they, as a rule, they got assistantship or a scholarship. But my comment was about the representing of the opportunities. So I think that university can get more students if the universities will be more active about presenting that there is opportunity really exists.
Well, any student can apply at the undergraduate level and will
I
get
know- yeah, I
and will
know
often
that.
get funding. Any student can apply at the graduate level.
It's about knowing
It's
that it exists.
it's knowing about it exists. I know that if they apply, they will get a really great support. But yeah.
Well, that's a possibility. That's a possibility, yeah. We get, to be honest, we're a very small program. We get more than enough applications. We get a lot, and even word of mouth seems to work. But yeah, you're right. We probably need to publicize it more and maybe think about funding this in a more systematic way. There is a question at the back and one at the front. Professor Magocsi was first, and then Natalia second. No, Bohdan Kordan third.
It was very nice to hear that at the University of Toronto, where I teach, this is the last department of Slavic studies. But believe me, as I'm sure Taras will say, that department also has problems in recruiting students. Let me begin by saying one thing. You cannot be a Ukrainianist, you cannot be interested seriously in Ukrainian studies unless you know the Ukrainian language. I very much sympathize with teachers of Ukrainian language who have an incredibly difficult task in preserving the pedagogy of teaching Ukrainian language. Without knowledge of Ukrainian language, forget it. You can never pursue anything in Ukrainian studies. Minimally Ukrainian language. Let's throw in some Russian, perhaps. Let's throw in some Polish. We have heard here, however, that we have a crisis. Departments are closing, etc. So, yesterday, I said in one of our discussions that academics should be doing scholarly matters and not be concerned with political activity. Well, that was yesterday.
Now it's a new Magocsi.
That's correct. So today, I'm going to talk about, at least mention, the imperative to being politically active. Politically active within one's institution and politically active outside of one's institution in the larger society. And whether that political activity is carried out by any one of you sitting there or any of us sitting here or the leaders of the institutions with whom we are associated is a different story. But why is political activity necessary? We've already heard, en passant, I believe, from our instructor in Ukrainian language, that she offers a course in business school, in business Ukrainian. The real name of the game within institutions is, in fact, to cooperate aggressively with business schools, with all of those departments that do practical things. So that's one level. But even that's not going to help, because the real battle is something that was lost probably 20 or 30 years ago. I had this discussion yesterday again with former Ambassador Fraser. The real battle is that the universities across the board removed language requirements. As long as when those language requirements have gone away, you've lost. There is literally, I'm sorry, nothing that you can do to save the teaching of language unless it is required. And in order for that to happen, then there has to be lobbying at the political level outside the university to convince the funders of universities, whether it is at the provincial level, that language is an economic imperative. It has nothing to do with let's be very practical here. Oh, it's nice to learn about Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture or Spanish and so forth and so on. Forget that. That argument is not going to fly. The only argument that's going to fly is that if the Canadian future generations want to and be competitive in the outside world, in a global economy, one needs to know languages, and not a smattering of languages as something that you've heard in kitchens at home, but formal knowledge of it. That is where the battle is. It's not even within universities, though you can do a little bit with business schools and IT programs. It's outside of the university. And who can take that initiative? You can't take it, we can't take it, but directors of institutions, lobbying, and also those political activists, including some of them from the past and from the present and future who are sitting there. That's where we have to engage these people to convince provincial governments to return language instruction required of every student as an economic imperative. Thank you.
Okay, Natalia, can you keep it short, please? We're already over time.
I regret to inform everybody that my question is about language instruction again. So interestingly enough, CIUS, that's what we're focusing on in this panel. I'll start a little bit from afar and I'll try to be brief. In our sort of a ladder of university courses, we begin with recruitment of students into Ukrainian studies with the language instructorship. In fact, in our university, the enrollments when it comes down to the Ukrainian studies are highest in the first year Ukrainian language class, and I think they're highest probably on this continent. Alla will later correct me if it's right or wrong. And yet we are in some sort of a conundrum as academics who are to advance and pursue the Ukrainian studies, mostly because we are not equipped professionally to do so. Alla, I think, is the only, Professor Nedashkivska, I think, is the only fully equipped professional to teach and deliberate and talk about how language needs to be taught. The rest of us are split between our main foci in literature, history, or we're dealing with another situation where we have faculty, not full-time, teaching the Ukrainian languages elsewhere. So I have a very practical suggestion. A year ago, University of Victoria, I believe, has organized a workshop, a seminar on how to teach Russian in North America. And I have been waiting for such an opportunity for our sessional faculty and for our part-time faculty who are involved with the foundational task of actually exposing our students to the Ukrainian studies through the net and meshwork of it, language itself, on how to do it perhaps in a more collected and coordinated rather not collected manner. So I think that's where CIUS can come in with the help and the leadership of professionals in the field, and perhaps started conversation how we can actually start sharing resources and using the textbooks which were developed here. And just to summarize, we also need to recognize that oftentimes students come into these classes for the sake of pursuing language out of the idea of it being cultural value, symbolic value, rather than the language as a tool that oftentimes will end up being having a practical implication. So there's always that challenge of teaching heritage students here, and then eventually sending them to Ukraine, where they are presented with a very different task of acquiring language of practical use as communication tool. So something to be addressed in these seminars. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah. We do have a trained methodologist in our program at the University of Manitoba in language teaching, and there is plenty of experience in other languages that we draw on. We have trained methodologists in German as well, and we share this. So it's not quite as bleak as that. Bohdan, do you have a final comment?
Sure. I'd like to return to the idea of the context, text and context. And also to bring attention again to this question of, language teaching, and of course the situation here at the University of Alberta, where we've seen a program basically being abolished. And in the context of multiculturalism, of course, we remember that the Institute was founded in the wake of, I guess, the adoption of the policy of multiculturalism, and of course the favorable political circumstances that existed at that time made it possible here at the University of Alberta. We have all of this Ukrainian specialists here at the university, and yet this is a place where we have, you know, a crisis now. And you have to ask yourself, well, you know, how could it have happened? We have this institute, and it seems logical that if you're going to save anything here that has to do with language, that it should be done here, right? But it didn't happen. Our administrators decided to go ahead and cut where they cut, and it happened to have hit the Ukrainianists pretty hard. So in the context of multiculturalism, though, it doesn't make sense. And I was at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress about meeting that took place about 2 weeks ago, and I heard a very interesting comment by Minister Dion about multiculturalism in particular. And what he said was striking, because he was a student at the time that multiculturalism policy was being adopted, and his father was on the Royal Commission of bilingualism and biculturalism, and he stressed that the Ukrainians were particularly important. They were key to the government adopting multiculturalism policy, and he thanked the Ukrainian community. He said, you know, your work helped us, you know, not just to adopt the policy, but also what it led to was, you know, you've helped identify the Canadian identity, or you have made a contribution towards that. And how does that make sense? Because obviously, you hear the politicians saying, you know, well, we're stressing diversity. We're stressing, you know, that Canada is a place of tolerance, of understanding. So in this context, all these cuts just don't make sense. And what I'd like to state here is that, you know, the university itself should be a reflection of the society. If we really are a multicultural society, then the university should reflect that, and reflect that, I think, and here in Edmonton in particular, the Ukrainian factor is very important. So we have to work to get, I think, the language classes reestablished in some way, or a program reestablished, you know, on the basis of the fact that at least the Faculty of Arts should reflect the principle of multiculturalism.
Thank you. Are there any things that the speakers would desperately want to say? Dominic?
Not desperate, but if you give me a minute.
Yeah.
On the comment by the student about better promoting the programs in Ukraine, I think she's right. It's in my mind all the time, and I think we could do infinitely better using the new technological tools, social media and so forth, as a community in Ukrainian studies. On Bohdan's comment, I found it very revealing that it came from a Quebecois, because multiculturalism is not very popular in Quebec, but the reality is that both the Quebecois and the Ukrainians have been extremely influential in forging Canadian identity without really realizing it. And here I am in Ukrainian studies. And on Bob's point about absolute necessity of learning languages, in comparative politics, it is an absolute necessity, misunderstood by our own colleagues in other subfields of political science. If you want to study the Middle East, you have to know Arabic. If you want to study China, you have to know Mandarin, etc. If you want to study Ukraine, you have to know Ukrainian and Russian, certainly Ukrainian. And that means, in our case here, we can't learn Ukrainian on campus, but there are other ways. It is a sine qua non. You just go in the field and you learn it. Now, that's a constant battle, but often it's a battle even within disciplines. Yeah.
Okay, well, that ends our session. Thank you to all the people who participated. We have two quick announcements.
First of all, let's thank our panel. So.